You know, usually when we ask you to picture a country that seems to be like achieving the ultimate environmental dream, a very specific and highly curated set of images immediately comes to mind.
Oh, absolutely. It's a very distinct aesthetic, isn't it? Like, if you're listening to this right now, you're probably picturing city streets completely dominated by bicycles.
Right, like somewhere in Scandinavia.
Exactly. Or, vast rolling green hills covered in state-of-the-art, totally silent wind turbines.
Yeah, you picture gleaming solar panels on every single terracotta roof
Mhm.
or bullet trains silently gliding between carbon-neutral megacities,
Right.
people sipping ethically sourced shade-grown coffee out of biodegradable mugs.
Yeah, that whole vibe.
It's this vision of a highly advanced, utterly frictionless society, a place that has somehow miraculously solved the climate crisis without sacrificing a single ounce of modern comfort.
Because in our minds, we implicitly equate the word green with highly developed.
We do. We really do.
Which honestly makes perfect sense to us, because developing, manufacturing, and deploying all those sustainable technologies requires immense wealth.
Totally.
It requires decades of funded research, stable infrastructure, and, a highly educated workforce to actually maintain it all.
But today, we want you to take that mental image, that beautiful utopian eco-city, and just completely throw it out the window.
Yeah, discard it.
Because we have a data point in front of us that is going to entirely shatter that assumption. We're going to look at a country whose carbon footprint is so breathtakingly low, it makes those utopian green cities look like smoke-belching industrial factories by comparison.
And the raw numbers on this are genuinely staggering when you isolate them on a spreadsheet.
Right. So prepare yourself for this reality check. Sudan's per capita carbon dioxide emissions sit at a minuscule 0.416 tons.
Just 0.416.
Yeah. Let me put that in perspective for you. The global average material footprint per capita, which is the sheer physical weight of resources the average human consumes, from biomass to fossil fuels, is over 12.7 tons.
Yeah, and in highly developed Western nations, carbon emissions can easily be 10, 15, or even 20 times higher than Sudan's.
Exactly. So on paper,
Yeah,
if you were like an alien scientist simply scanning a database for planetary impact,
yeah.
Sudan looks like an incredible, unprecedented triumph of sustainability.
Right, it looks like the greenest place on Earth.
If you are just looking at the environmental scoreboard, it looks like they've won the game.
But, and this is the massive unavoidable but that we are unpacking today,
Right.
that ultra-low planetary footprint is not a triumph of sustainable policy.
Wow.
It's not the result of advanced green technology or enlightened environmental legislation. It is, tragically, a symptom of devastating systemic poverty.
And that paradox is the core tension of our entire conversation today.
Yes.
We're looking at what actually happens when a low planetary footprint is entirely involuntary.
Right, when you don't have a choice.
So here is our mission for this deep dive.
Yeah.
We have gotten our hands on a massive, highly detailed, somewhat intimidating data set.
It's a lot of numbers.
It really is. It's the 2024 United Nations Human Development Data. It's this sprawling stack of research that tracks a vast array of metrics from 1990 all the way to 2023.
And we are going to use this data stack to relentlessly analyze the widening gap between Sudan and the global average.
Because we want to understand what a low planetary footprint actually looks like on the ground when it's driven by a profound lack of human development.
Exactly, because when you dig into the methodology, the numbers tell a story that is vastly more complicated and infinitely more human than a simple emissions graph could ever capture.
Okay, let's unpack this. If a country is barely leaving a physical mark on the planet, is that actually a success story?
That's the question.
Right, or is that the ultimate red flag? Is it an indicator of a society that has been so systematically stripped of its resources and infrastructure that its people are fundamentally denied their potential to grow?
We really want you to reconsider everything you assume about what sustainability actually means in different corners of the world.
This is a purely data-driven journey into the real, tangible human cost hiding behind those pristine green numbers.
And to truly grasp that human cost, to not just read the numbers but actually understand them, We have to start at the absolute foundation.
Right.
We have to look at how the global community even attempts to measure human well-being, because you can't just ask, hey, are people happy?
No, you need a baseline metric.
Exactly. And in the UN data stack, that baseline is the Human Development Index, the HDI.
The HDI. I feel like we hear this acronym thrown around in news reports all the time, but before we get into the massive divergence between Sudan and the rest of the world, I really need you to break down exactly what this index is.
Sure.
Because historically, economists used to just look at GDP, right? Gross domestic product.
Yeah.
They just ask, like, how much money a country printed?
That's exactly how it used to be done. For decades, the global scorecard was just GDP. The basic assumption was, well, if a country makes a lot of money, the people there must be doing well. But in the late 1980s and early 1990s, economists like Amartya Sen and Mahbub ul Haq realized how deeply flawed that was.
How so?
Well, GDP is just a measure of economic output. It tells you literally nothing about how that wealth is distributed.
Oh, why so?
Or if it's actually improving human lives. Like if a country discovers oil, its GDP skyrockets overnight.
Right.
But if all that oil money goes to, say, 10 billionaires while the rest of the country starves, the GDP still looks fantastic on paper.
Oh, right. It's the classic flaw of averages.
Exactly.
If I'm sitting in a room with a billionaire, our average wealth is $500 million.
Right.
But I still can't afford to buy lunch.
Precisely. So the creation of the HDI was this brilliant paradigm-shifting moment. It was designed to move away from just asking, how much money does this country make?
Okay.
And start asking, what kind of lives are people actually able to lead? It's based on the capability approach. What are humans capable of doing and being in this society?
That makes a lot more sense.
Yeah. So to measure this, the HDI acts as a composite index. Think of it as a three-legged stool.
Okay, break down the three legs for me.
Leg number one is a long and healthy life. This is measured quite literally by life expectancy at birth.
Got it. Health.
Right. Leg number two is access to knowledge. This is measured by a combination of expected years of schooling for children and the actual mean years of schooling for adults.
Education. Okay.
And finally, leg number three is a decent standard of living, which is measured by gross national income, or GNI per capita, adjusted for the local cost of living.
So, wealth. So the stool needs all three to function.
Exactly.
Like if you have immense wealth from, say, a natural resource boom, but your healthcare infrastructure is so terrible that people die in their 40s, the stool falls over.
It completely collapses.
Or if you have a long life but no schools to attend so you can't read, you aren't really thriving. You're just surviving for a long time. You need health, knowledge, and resources to stand tall.
That is the perfect way to look at it. And that brings us to the core of our data stack today. When we look at this UN data from 1990 to 2023, tracking that three-legged stool, we see two entirely different global trajectories. It's what I look at as the Great Divergence.
Okay, let's look at the global average HDI first, just to set the baseline.
Right. Over the last 3 decades, despite massive financial crises, despite global pandemics, regional wars, the world's overall HDI has seen a steady, continuous, almost relentless climb upward.
So humanity on the whole is trending in a positive direction.
Broadly speaking, yes. By 2023, the global average HDI sits comfortably in what the UN classifies as the high human development category. The global HDI is around 0.756.
Okay, so a score of 0.756 is our baseline for the global average. The world is generally getting healthier, smarter, and wealthier.
Exactly.
But how does that compare to the spreadsheet for Sudan?
This is where the divergence becomes agonizingly clear. If you trace Sudan's line on that exact same graph from 1990 onwards, the growth is incredibly slow.
Just creeping along.
Yeah, it creeps up slightly during the 2000s, but then starting around 2019, it hits a wall. The line just plateaus. It flattens out completely. And then, terrifyingly, in the most recent data, it actually starts to drop.
Drop.
Yeah. By 2023, Sudan's HDI value has fallen to 0.511.
Wait, 0.511 compared to a global average of 0.756?
Yes.
That is a massive gap. Where does a score of 0.511 actually place them on the global stage?
Yeah.
Like, if this is a scorecard, what is their rank?
It places them firmly in the bottom tier of the low human development category. Specifically, out of 203 countries and territories measured by the UN, Sudan ranks 186.
186 out of 203.
Wow. They are in the absolute bottom 10% of the planet. There is a 0.245-point gap between them and the global average.
And in the world of human development metrics, a quarter of a point is an absolute chasm.
Enormous.
I want to zoom in on the very first leg of that HGI stool because I think it's really easy for us to get lost in index scores like 0.511. Let's talk about the health dimension.
Okay, let's do it.
Because to me, this is where the data completely stops being abstract math and becomes incredibly visceral. We are talking about the sheer length of time a human being is allowed to exist on this earth.
Right. The primary metric here is life expectancy at birth, and the contrast is stark.
Set the stage for us.
So let's look at the 2023 global averages. Globally, despite all the health challenges the world faces, the average life expectancy has grown to about 73.4 years.
Okay, so roughly 73 years is what a human born today can reasonably expect to experience.
Oh, correct.
What is the biological reality in Sudan?
In Sudan, the 2023 data shows the overall life expectancy is only 66.3 years.
66.3.
Yeah, and if we break it down further, looking at previous years and demographic splits, it gets more concerning. For men specifically, the numbers often hover in the low 60s, around 63.3 years in some recent measurements.
Wow.
With women slightly higher at 69.6, but focusing on the overall average of 66.3 against the global 73.4, you are looking at a massive deficit.
Let me just pause and sit with that. 66.3 years versus 73.4 years. We were talking about a gap of roughly 7 years compared to the global average.
7 years.
Let me use an analogy here because it's the only way I could really wrap my head around a statistic that heavy.
Go for it.
Imagine finding out that simply because of the geographic coordinates of your birthplace, you are being hit with a time tax.
A time tax.
Yeah, you are taxed 7 years of your life, just seized from you by the environment you were born into. What does a society actually lose when its elders are missing, when people are routinely passing away in their early to mid-60s?
That is the exact right question we should be asking the data, because a lower life expectancy doesn't just mean fewer years of retirement for the individual.
Right.
It profoundly reshapes the entire structural architecture of a society. Think about the institutional memory that is lost.
The oral history, the trade secrets.
Exactly. Think about the grandmothers and grandfathers who simply aren't there to help raise the next generation.
Oh, that's a huge point.
In developed nations, grandparents provide an immense amount of free, trusted childcare.
Which allows parents to re-enter the workforce.
Yes. When you remove that generation, you force parents, usually mothers, to stay out of the economy to care for children. Think about the master craftsmen, the experienced university professors, the senior surgeons who are lost in what should be their prime mentoring years.
Wow, yeah.
A time tax of 7 years doesn't just hurt the individual who passes away, it mathematically bankrupts the community's human capital. It completely alters the dependency ratio of the entire nation.
And as I'm looking at this UN spreadsheet, there's a specific anomaly in the health data that really jumps out.
The 2021 drop.
Yes. The trend line for Sudan's life expectancy isn't just lower than the rest of the world, it actually breaks. Around the 2020 to 2021 mark, Sudan's overall life expectancy takes a noticeable sharp dip.
It does.
It drops down from over 65 years to roughly 64.46 years. And for men, it dropped even lower, down to 61.7 years in 2021. Now, I have to ask, how does a number like that suddenly fall off a cliff? Because biology doesn't just change overnight.
You're entirely correct. From a demographic perspective, life expectancy at birth is usually a very, very stubborn metric.
Right.
It has a lot of inertia. It takes decades of gradual improvement in municipal sanitation, national vaccination campaigns, and agricultural nutrition to make it go up even a single year.
So it shouldn't just drop.
Conversely, it doesn't just drop overnight because people are eating a little bit less healthily or skipping the gym.
Right. It requires something cataclysmic.
Exactly. When you see life expectancy drop abruptly, like we see in the 2021 data, it indicates a massive systemic shock.
A shock to the system.
It means the foundational pillars of human survival have been violently shaken.
But how does the UN even measure that? If a country is going through a systemic shock, which usually implies political instability, conflict, or the collapse of supply chains, how are researchers even gathering accurate mortality data?
It's tough.
I have to admit, I'm a little skeptical of how precise a number like 64.46 can be during a crisis.
And it's a very valid skepticism. During periods of intense internal turmoil, civil registries, like the offices that record births and deaths, they often stop functioning entirely.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So the UN and its partner agencies rely on complex demographic modeling. They use household surveys, demographic and health surveys, and satellite data to track population movements and agricultural yields. satellites.
Wow, satellite data.
Yeah, they look at excess mortality modeling. It involves interpolation, and it definitely carries a margin of error. But the macro trend is undeniable.
And what actually causes the drop on the ground, like physically?
Without taking any political sides regarding the specific internal factions or events in Sudan, the UN data impartially records the biological reality of instability. It's basically a logistical failure.
A logistical failure.
Right. When regional hospitals can't get diesel fuel delivered for their backup generators, incubators stop working.
Oh, God.
When supply lines for basic, cheap antibiotics are severed by roadblocks, treatable infections become fatal.
Right.
When agricultural planting cycles are disrupted because farmers are displaced, it leads to severe malnutrition a season later, which makes the whole population highly vulnerable to endemic diseases.
So everything cascades.
Exactly. That logistical collapse is what causes the life expectancy curve to point downward. It is the mathematical echo of societal trauma.
Okay, so surviving in Sudan is already a monumental daily challenge, heavily taxed by the environment and instability.
Yes.
But surviving, breathing, just making it to tomorrow, that is only the very first step of human development. If you manage to navigate that healthcare system and make it past childhood, the next hurdle is what you can actually do with that life.
Right.
Thriving requires knowledge. It requires resources, which means we need to transition our focus from the length of life to the quality of life. Let's look at the second leg of the HDI stool, education.
If health is about whether you actually get to sit at the table and play the game of life, education and wealth dictate what kind of hand you are dealt.
I like that.
Let's unpack the education data because the UN tracks this using two distinct, very revealing metrics: expected years of schooling and mean years of schooling.
Okay.
And the gap between these two numbers is where the true heartbreak lies.
I need you to break those two terms down for me because they sound very similar. What is expected versus mean?
Expected years of schooling, or EYS, is essentially a projection. It's a theoretical measure of how many years a young child entering the school system today should expect to receive, assuming that current enrollment rates across all age groups stay exactly the same throughout their life.
Okay, so it's a forecast.
Right. Globally, a child can expect about 13.04 years of schooling on average.
13 years. Let's visualize that. That's a solid, comprehensive foundation.
Yeah.
That means you go through primary school, you go through high school, and you likely get a year or two of higher education, university, or specialized vocational training.
Exactly.
You learn to read, obviously, but you also learn critical thinking, algebra, global history, digital literacy. What is the theoretical expectation in Sudan?
In Sudan, the expected years of schooling drops precipitously. The overall expectation is around 8.62 years.
8.62.
Yeah, and for females, it's 8.4 years, and for males, it's 8.8.
So immediately before a child even picks up a pencil,
Yeah.
their theoretical educational ceiling is lowered by nearly 5 years compared to the rest of the planet.
It is.
They aren't even statistically expected to reach high school.
But you mentioned that the difference between expected and mean is the real story here.
Yes.
Because expected is just the theoretical future based on current enrollment. It's a hope. Mean years of schooling, or MYS, is the cold, hard, unyielding reality of the present. It calculates the actual average number of years of education received by the current adult population, people aged 25 and older.
Okay, so what adults have actually experienced? What's the global average?
Globally, the mean years of schooling is roughly 8.7 years.
And in Sudan, what is the reality for an adult today?
Sudan's mean years of schooling is a tragically low 3.96 years overall.
Wait.
And if you look at the gender split from recent data sets, it's around 3.6 years for females and 4.2 years for males.
Hold the phone. Under 4 years of total schooling.
Yeah.
Let's really slow down and think about what that physically means for a human brain and a human life.
It's profound.
If you drop out of the educational system after roughly 3.5 or 4 years, you are, what, 8 or 9 years old?
Around there, yes.
You might have basic functional literacy. You can probably read a street sign. You can maybe read a basic document. You can do basic addition and subtraction. But you are fundamentally, structurally locked out of participating in a modern, sustainable global economy.
Absolutely.
You aren't learning environmental science. You aren't learning software coding. You aren't learning advanced, drought-resistant agricultural techniques.
No.
You are essentially stranded in the 19th century while the rest of the world races into the 21st.
If we connect this severe educational deficit to the bigger macroeconomic picture, an average of under 4 years of schooling means an entire national population is trapped. Without advanced education, an economy simply cannot diversify. It cannot innovate. The workforce is relegated entirely to low-yield survival labor.
Just scraping by.
We are talking about subsistence farming, rudimentary manual labor, and informal, highly vulnerable street trading. It is a massive generational misallocation of human potential.
And linking back to our intro.
Right. You cannot build a high-tech green economy if your workforce cannot read the manuals to install the solar panels.
Exactly. And that profound lack of educational capital directly dictates the third and final leg of our HDI stool: wealth.
Yes, the two are inextricably linked.
If you only have 4 years of schooling, your earning potential is completely handicapped.
Okay.
Let's talk about the gross national income, or GNI, per capita.
The GNI data is where the disparity between Sudan and the world becomes almost unfathomable to a Western listener. And I want to clarify something first. These numbers are adjusted for purchasing power parity, or PPP.
Right, PPT, because a dollar buys a lot more in Khartoum than it does in New York City.
Exactly. PPT accounts for the local cost of living, so we are measuring actual tangible purchasing power, not just straight currency exchange rates.
Makes sense.
Globally, the average GNI per capita is over $20,327 in PPP terms.
Okay.
For men, it's higher, and for women, it's lower, but the global blended average is north of $20,000.
Okay, so a global average of 20 grand a year in purchasing power. Enough for housing, food, maybe some savings, some disposable income.
Now look at the data for Sudan. Sudan's overall GNI per capita is a fraction of that, sitting at roughly $2,810. That is barely 13% of the global average. But the data reveals a gender divide inside that number that is absolutely staggering.
Okay, brace me.
The GNI for Sudanese men is $4,742. The GNI for Sudanese women is $909.
Oh, sorry, did you say $909?
Yes.
For an entire year?
For an entire year.
Let me make sure I'm reading this right. An income of $909 a year for half the population versus a global average of over $20,000.
That's what the data says.
That isn't just a wealth gap. That's entirely different economic universes coexisting on the same planet.
It really is.
Let's break down $909 a year. That is roughly, what, $2.59 a day in purchasing power?
And you have to remember the golden rule of statistics here. That is the mean income. That is the average.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Which brings up a terrifying point about how data works.
Yeah.
Because as genuinely horrific as these averages are, an HDI of 0.511, a life expectancy of 66, an income of 909 averages are notoriously deceptive.
They hide a lot.
They can act like a thick blanket, completely covering up the true contours of suffering underneath. If I go back to my earlier analogy, if one politician or general in a room has $10 million and 9 citizens in the room have 0.
The average says everyone in the room is a millionaire.
Exactly. Averages mask the extremes. Averages hide the billionaires, and more importantly, they hide the people surviving on 0.
And that is exactly why the UN data stack includes our next crucial foundational metric, the Inequality-Adjusted Human Development Index, the IHDI.
Which means we need to look at how the wealth, health, and education we just talked about are actually distributed across the population. Because my guess is it's not an even spread.
Not at all. The IHDI is essentially a mathematical reality check. It takes that overall HDI score we started with, that 0.511 MASH, and it systematically discounts it, penalizes it, based on the level of inequality within the country.
So it lowers the score if things are unfair.
Yes. If a country had a perfectly utopian equal distribution of resources, its HDI and IHDI would be exactly the same number. But the more unequal the distribution of health, education, and income between the rich and the poor, the more the value drops. Globally, the world loses about 21.9% of its human development potential to inequality.
Okay, so the world as a whole takes a 22% haircut because resources aren't shared evenly. How harsh is the reality check for Sudan?
It is severe. The data reveals that Sudan loses a massive 35.8% of its total HDI value due to inequality.
35.8%.
Over a third of its human development is simply erased by unequal distribution.
Let me try a different analogy here to visualize this, because 35.8% loss sounds a bit academic and dry.
Sure, go ahead.
Let's imagine the country is a person carrying water from a deep, hard-to-reach well back to their village.
Okay.
The water in the bucket represents national health, education, and wealth. But there are gaping holes in the bucket, and those holes are severe systemic inequality.
I see where you're going.
Because of those structural holes, more than a third of the water spills into the sand and evaporates before the bucket ever reaches anyone who actually thirsts for it.
That is a very accurate, visceral way to visualize the mathematics of the IHDI. And the beauty of this UN data is that it actually allows us to look at exactly which holes in the bucket are the largest.
We can see where the leaks are.
Exactly. We can break down that 35.8% overall loss into its specific dimensions. For instance, inequality in life expectancy accounts for a 24.05% loss.
Stop right there. Inequality in life expectancy.
Yeah.
That means that while the average life expectancy is 66, some wealthy, elite segments of the population living in secure areas with private doctors are living well into their 80s.
Yes.
While the poorest populations in rural or conflict-heavy areas are dying much, much younger.
Unfortunately, yes. It means access to survival itself is commodified, but the other two dimensions are actually even worse.
Worse than health.
Yeah, income inequality destroys 39.33% of their potential development. But the largest, most devastating gap of all is in education. Inequality in education strips away 42.45% of potential development.
Over 42% loss just in education.
It's massive.
So if we go back to our bucket analogy, what are the actual physical holes causing that leak?
Yeah.
Because it tells me that whatever good schools do exist in Sudan, whatever functioning universities there are, they are completely walled off from the vast majority of the population.
The physical holes are infrastructure and privatization. Hole number one is the urban-rural divide.
Okay.
The government might allocate a budget for education, but the qualified teachers, the textbooks, and the reliable electricity are all concentrated in the capital city, Khartoum.
Right.
If you live in a rural province, your school might literally be a chalkboard under a tree.
Wow.
Hole number two is the privatization of quality. The elites opt out of the public system entirely, sending their children to private international schools or abroad.
Meaning there is zero political pressure from the powerful classes to fix the public system.
Exactly. The water never reaches the sand.
Synthesizing all these numbers,
Mm.
a very grim picture emerges about how we consume news.
Yes.
It means that when you are scrolling on your phone and you read a headline from a financial outlet saying Sudan's economy grows by 2% or Sudan sees development gains,
Right.
you have to immediately ask, who is actually capturing that growth?
Right.
This inequality data screams that even when fragile statistical development gains are made, they are disproportionately captured by a tiny elite fraction of the population.
Oh, entirely.
The vast, vast majority of everyday citizens never feel a single ripple of that statistical growth. It remains a mathematical fiction to them.
And the systemic inequality, this leaky bucket, doesn't just affect everyone randomly. The data shows us with absolute terrifying clarity that this structural failure falls heaviest on one specific demographic.
It targets them.
Yes.
Which brings us to the fault lines of gender. Because when things get desperate, when resources are scarce, societal biases become incredibly pronounced. Let's look at the data on gender disparities and the labor market.
To measure this disparity, the UN uses two specific indices, the Gender Development Index, the GDI, and the Gender Inequality Index, the GI. The GDI measures the gap in the basic HDI between men and women, so health, knowledge, standard of living.
Right.
The global GDI sits at 0.955. Now, a score of 1.0 means perfect parity. So globally, while we aren't there yet, we are approaching a baseline of equality in basic potential.
And what is Sudan's GDI score?
Sudan's GDI is 0.813.
0.813.
Yeah. The UN categorizes countries into 5 groups based on this, and Sudan is placed in Group 5, the very bottom tier, designating countries with the absolute lowest gender parity on Earth.
That's brutal.
But the Gender Inequality Index, the GII, is where we stop looking at potential and start looking at the physical, structural hurdles that women face in society.
We already touched on the massive income gap, at $909 versus $4,742 reality.
We did, but the most shocking number to me is in maternal health.
You're talking about the maternal mortality ratio.
Yes. In Sudan, the maternal mortality ratio is 270.3 deaths per 100,000 live births.
Wow. 270 mothers dying for every 100,000 successful deliveries. Just to provide global context for you listening, the world average is around 216, largely dragged up by developing nations.
Yeah.
But in many highly developed nations, that number is in the single digits, maybe 3 or 5 or 10.
Let's talk about the logistics of that number, because maternal mortality isn't just a medical failure, it's a supply chain failure.
How do you mean?
If a woman in a rural village goes into labor and a complication arises, say hemorrhaging, she needs 3 things to survive. First, she needs a vehicle with fuel.
Okay.
Second, she needs a paved road that isn't washed out by seasonal rains or blocked by conflict. Third, she needs a clinic with a functioning refrigerator storing oxytocin and a doctor with clean surgical tools.
Have a whole chain of events.
Exactly. If any single one of those links in the chain breaks, she becomes a statistic. That is why the number is 270.3.
And having a maternal mortality rate that high must profoundly alter the psychological and economic reality of womanhood in that society.
It changes everything.
Pregnancy ceases to be just a natural life progression. It becomes a legitimate life or death gamble.
Yes.
And if you are terrified of dying in childbirth, or if you are constantly recovering from debilitating unsupported pregnancies, how can you possibly focus on entering the workforce, or traveling for higher education, or starting a business?
You can't. It structurally restricts women's willingness and physical ability to plan long term.
But hold on, here's where it gets really interesting. I'm looking at the next column in this UN spreadsheet. And there is a data point here under the Gender Inequality Index that feels like it belongs to a completely different country.
Oh, I know the one you're looking at.
It tracked political representation. The data says that women hold 31.04% of the parliament seats in Sudan.
Yes, 31.04%.
Wait, I need to stop and challenge this. How do we reconcile this?
It's confusing, right?
How does a country have nearly a third of its highest government legislative body run by women? A percentage that, by the way, actually beats out several highly developed Western democracies. Yet simultaneously, they have a maternal mortality rate of 270 and an average female income of $909.
It's a huge contradiction.
Let's cross-reference this with the labor force participation rate. The data shows that despite holding 31% of parliament, the female labor force participation rate is a dismal 14.39%.
Right.
Meanwhile, the male participation rate is 61.87%. How do you have a third of the government run by women but shut women entirely out of the everyday rank-and-file workforce? It makes no logical sense. It's like discovering a gleaming glass penthouse built on top of a building with no stairs.
It is a massive paradox, but it's actually a very common one in international development.
Yeah.
What you are seeing is the disconnect between legislative window dressing and grassroots reality.
Window dressing.
Yes. A high percentage of women in parliament in developing nations is very often the result of top-down political quotas. A government mandates that a certain percentage of seats must be given to women.
Why do they do that?
Just to look good.
Often, yes. To satisfy international observers, to unlock foreign aid from Western donors, or to meet UN development goals on paper. It's a political band-aid.
Oh, wow.
It's an artificial insertion at the very top of the social pyramid.
So it doesn't actually reflect a cultural shift at all.
Not at all. Because top-down political quotas do not automatically dismantle grassroots societal barriers.
Right.
A female parliamentarian sitting in a government building in the Capitol does not magically create paved roads, maternal health clinics, or affordable childcare in rural villages.
Yeah.
A quota doesn't immediately erase centuries of deeply ingrained cultural norms that dictate a woman's place is exclusively in the home. It doesn't fix a legal system that might restrict a woman's ability to own land, inherit property, or open a bank account without a male guardian's permission. And the historical data shows this 14.39% workforce participation wasn't always the case. It hasn't just been historically flat, it actually crashed.
Yes, the 2011 crash.
If we look back around 2011, the female participation rate was roughly 24%. It has plummeted down to 14.39% by 2023. Why did it drop so drastically?
When you see a drop that significant, you are looking at an economy that has contracted severely.
Okay.
And there's a brutal economic rule. When formal jobs disappear due to instability, women are almost always the first to be pushed out of the labor market.
That's terrible.
They are forced back into unpaid domestic labor, or they are pushed into the highly vulnerable informal sector.
The informal sector, you mean like selling goods on the street?
Yes, selling
Yeah.
tea on the sidewalk, running an unregistered market stall. And the tragic irony is that informal labor often isn't captured by official government labor force statistics.
So they're working, but they're invisible.
Exactly. Mathematically, they don't exist.
It paints a picture of a population that is quite literally fighting a daily battle for basic survival, which perfectly transitions us into looking beyond just the financial metrics.
Right.
So we've talked a lot about income, that 909 time figure. But this UN data argues that poverty in a place like Sudan isn't just about a lack of cash.
Right. Money is just an abstract representation of resources. It's a tool.
Yeah.
But when poverty is deep enough, the abstraction of money falls away entirely, and you are left with the brutal physical absence of survival requirements.
Okay.
The UN tracks this using one of my favorite, most revealing metrics,
Okay.
the Multidimensional Poverty Index, or the MPI.
Multidimensional, meaning poverty isn't just an empty wallet.
Precisely. The MPI looks at overlapping deprivations across health, education, and living standards at the household level.
Yeah.
It doesn't ask, how much do you earn?
What does it ask?
It asks, are you physically malnourished? Do you have a dirt floor? Do you have to walk more than an hour a day just to get clean water?
And what do the numbers say?
The data shows Sudan's MPI headcount sits at a staggering 52.3%.
Over half the country.
Over half the population is living in severe multidimensional poverty, and the UN breaks down exactly what is dragging them under. Let's look at the weights.
Okay, let's hear it.
Nutrition makes up 17.7% of the total poverty burden.
Let's unpack nutrition. We aren't talking about missing a meal. We're talking about chronic, caloric, and vitamin deficits that literally stunt brain development in children.
Exactly. Stunting limits cognitive potential before a child is even old enough for school. Next, years of schooling contributes 16.1% to the burden, and school attendance is another 13.0%.
So almost 30% of the weight of their poverty is just a lack of basic education.
Yes.
Which goes back to those missing rural schools.
Yes, but the standard of living indicators are where the physical reality becomes incredibly stark for over half the population.
Hit me with the numbers.
Deprivation in housing contributes 10.3% to the burden, lack of electricity is 8.5%, and lack of safe drinking water contributes 7.1%.
Let's stop and really internalize that. Think about your own life for a second. We often think of poverty in the developed world as not being able to afford rent or having to skip meals to pay the winter heating bill.
Right.
And to be clear, those are terrible, stressful hardships. But this data shows a reality where over half the population is missing the foundational physical infrastructure of life itself.
It's hard to fathom.
I want you to ask yourself, how do you focus on building a career? How do you focus on innovating? How do you participate in a global green economy when your primary daily goal, your literal physical objective for the day, is finding clean drinking water and carrying it back to a house with no electricity?
You can't. Your entire cognitive bandwidth, your mental RAM, and all of your physical energy are entirely consumed by the massive friction of basic survival.
Mental RAM, I like that.
It's what psychologists call the scarcity mindset. This raises a hugely important point about international aid.
Right.
This multidimensional index is crucial because it shows that simply transferring cash or giving a microloan to a family won't fix Sudan.
Because if you give a family cash, what do they buy?
Exactly. You can give a family $100, but if there is no electrical grid to plug a refrigerator into and no municipal pipes carrying clean water to their village, they remain in multidimensional poverty.
The cash doesn't create a water treatment plant.
Exactly. The country requires immense foundational macro-level infrastructure development. They need concrete, steel, water treatment plants, and thousands of miles of high-voltage power lines.
And that word infrastructure brings us full circle.
It does.
It brings us right back to our starting point, to the hook of this entire deep dive, the planetary paradox, low emissions versus high deprivation.
We started by noting Sudan's incredibly low per capita carbon emissions of 0.416 tons. To analyze this properly, the UN created a relatively new metric, the Planetary Pressures Adjusted Human Development Index.
The PHDI.
The PHDI.
Explain the math behind the PHDI to me. What does it actually do to the regular HDI score we started with?
The PHDI takes a country's human development score and essentially penalizes it for the environmental damage it took to achieve that high standard of living.
Okay.
It adjusts the HDI downward based on two distinct things: carbon dioxide emissions per capita and material footprint per capita.
And material footprint, just to be clear, is essentially the total amount of raw materials.
Yeah.
Biomass, fossil fuels, metal ores, minerals extracted globally to meet the consumption demands of that specific country.
Correct. So if you import a car, the iron ore mined in Australia to build that car counts against your material footprint.
Got it.
Globally, when you apply this planetary pressure penalty, the world's overall HDI drops significantly by about 10%.
10%.
Because the global material footprint is massive, around 12.7 tons per capita, we are a heavy, resource-hungry global civilization. So the global HDI takes a big hit when you factor in the true planetary cost of our lifestyles.
But then we look at Sudan's PHDI.
Right. What's fascinating here is Sudan's material footprint is a mere 4.17 tons per capita. Their carbon emissions at 0.416 are basically a statistical rounding error on the global scale. Because of this extreme lack of planetary pressure, adjusting for emissions only causes Sudan's HDI to drop by a tiny, tiny margin, just 2.54%.
So their score barely moves.
Exactly.
They aren't penalized by the math because they aren't polluting. And if we look at the most recent data, we see their regular HDI dropped from 0.516 in 2022 to 0.511 in 2023. They experienced a drop in global rankings across the board.
Yeah, across the board.
When every single metric we've discussed today, health, education, wealth, gender, inequality, they are in the bottom 10% of the globe.
And this is where the paradox fully materializes. Sudan's green footprint is an illusion.
It's totally an illusion.
It is a mathematical ghost. It is absolutely not the result of a highly advanced, sustainable, circular economy like the ones we pictured at the start of the show.
No bicycles and wind turbines.
No. It is an indicator of a society that has simply not yet industrialized. They aren't burning fossil fuels because they don't have a reliable power grid to burn them for.
Right.
They don't have a high material footprint because half the country lacks adequate housing, cement, and drinking water pipes. The low emissions are a direct byproduct of poverty, conflict, and systemic inequality that actively destroys development.
So what does this all mean? How do we contextualize this?
Well,
It seems to me that looking at Sudan's low emissions and calling them sustainable or eco-friendly is a grotesque mischaracterization of reality. It's like looking at a person who is starving to death and celebrating them for successfully sticking to a low-calorie diet.
wow. That is exactly what it is. And it highlights a massive glaring flaw in how we in the developed world sometimes talk about environmentalism.
Yeah.
True sustainability isn't just about achieving zero impact. A rock has zero impact.
A rock, that's a great point.
True sustainability is about finding a complex balance where humans can actually thrive, achieve high development, educate their children, and live long, healthy lives without destroying the biosphere in the process. Sudan currently has near zero planetary impact, but its people are fundamentally not thriving.
Which brings us to the end of our roadmap. We have dug through decades of UN human development data.
Decades of it.
We've looked at the missing years of life, the empty classrooms, the severe wealth gaps, the leaky buckets of inequality, and the daily fight for water.
Yeah.
What are the ultimate takeaways from this vast data stack? If you were handed this spreadsheet and told to fix it, what does the math say the mission must be?
The data dictates a very clear, albeit incredibly difficult, order of operations.
Okay, what's first?
First, the primary mission for human development in Sudan must be solving multidimensional poverty. You cannot build a modern, diversified economy until the foundational deprivations, drinking water, housing, electricity, and basic childhood nutrition are resolved.
You have to build the floor before you can build the ceiling.
Exactly.
10 seconds.
Second, the most mathematically efficient lever to rapidly raise the overall HDI is unlocking female potential.
You have to get that female labor force participation rate up from 14.39%.
Absolutely. You have an enormous intelligent segment of the population whose economic and intellectual potential is currently locked away behind maternal health crises and a lack of early schooling.
It's tragic.
Improving female education and maternal health logistics isn't just a moral imperative. The data shows it is the most powerful economic engine available to a developing nation. And finally, structural inequality must be dismantled. The holes in the bucket must be patched so that whatever economic growth they do achieve actually reaches the people who need it, rather than being hoarded by a tiny elite in the capital.
It's a massive generational undertaking.
It is.
It requires transitioning from a society entirely focused on sheer daily survival to one capable of long-term investment in its own human capital.
Perfectly said.
But I want to leave you, our listener, with a final, somewhat provocative thought to mull over. Something that wasn't explicitly spelled out in the UN data, but is the logical next step of this entire conversation.
Ooh, I'm intrigued. What's the thought?
Well, we established that Sudan's low emissions are an illusion born of poverty.
Right.
They lack industrial infrastructure. They don't have a massive grid. But looking at it from another angle, Sudan is effectively a blank slate when it comes to carbon-heavy industrial infrastructure.
Okay.
They haven't spent the last century building thousands of massive coal power plants that they now have to painfully and expensively decommission.
You're talking about the concept of leapfrogging.
Exactly. While their current lack of development is an undeniable human tragedy, does it also offer a totally unique, unprecedented opportunity? As the rest of the developed world spends trillions of dollars trying to awkwardly retrofit its dirty economies, tearing up gas lines, subsidizing electric vehicles, replacing combustion engines. Could nations like Sudan leapfrog the fossil fuel era entirely?
Wow.
Could they take international investment and build a sustainable 21st century green economy entirely from scratch, going straight to decentralized solar grids instead of building coal plants?
It's the ultimate development dream, going straight from no grid to a smart, renewable grid, skipping the dirty industrial revolution entirely.
But the flip side of that question, and this is what I want the listener to really think about, is that fair?
Yeah, right.
Is asking a nation that is currently struggling to provide basic clean drinking water and maternal health care to pioneer advanced green tech just another unfair burden placed on the developing world by the wealthy nations who already polluted their way to the top?
That's a heavy question.
We got rich by burning cheap coal. Should they have the right to industrialize quickly and cheaply, even if it's dirty, just to get their people out of multidimensional poverty?
That tension right there between the immediate need for human survival and the long-term need for planetary survival is the defining geopolitical question of climate change and human development for the next century.
It really is. We want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been fascinating.
We hope this exploration encourages you to always question the pristine numbers you see in the news.
Yes.
When you see an average, look for the extreme inequality hiding beneath it. When you see a green statistic, ask what the human cost was to achieve it.
Always look for the messy, complicated human stories hidden inside the rigid spreadsheets.
Because the data is never just numbers.
No, it is the architecture of human lives.
Because as we've learned today, the ultimate environmental dream, a country with a tiny carbon footprint and a fraction of the global material consumption, isn't always what it seems on paper. Sometimes a perfectly clean X-ray doesn't mean the patient is healthy. It just means the machine is broken. Keep diving deep, and we'll see you next time.